Since the enactment of the Orphan Drug Act in 1983, there's been, obviously, it's been a spectacularly successful piece of legislation. The investment in R&D and the number of therapies that have been approved are have been well documented. But yet, despite this, there are many unique regulatory challenges that require unique regulatory expertise. Now, I've had the privilege of having been involved with the Orphan Drug Act since I was at the FDA in 1983. And so it was actually my research that led to the 1984 amendments to the Orphan Drug Act. So what has this done? My experience with the Orphan Drug Act has given me the gift of perspective. Perspective has allowed me to see that, for instance, in about 10 years ago, the 25th anniversary of the Orphan Drug Act, I saw that it was time to look at it with fresh eyes and see if there were things that we could do. And when we did that analysis, what we came up with was several things. And that led to the Congressional Caucus. That led to the Office of Rare Diseases in the Center for Drugs. That led to the first FDA public hearing on orphan drugs in June 2010. So that was our analysis 10 years ago on the 25th anniversary. We now stand here on the 35th anniversary of the Orphan Drug Act. It's 10 years later. And it seemed to me, from my perspective, that it's time for us to again start another conversation to see if there are ways that now we can improve what we do. So let's start that conversation and see what comes of it. So I'm a lawyer. And so my touchstone for reality is the law. So I always start with the law, and I had the privilege of being involved with the 21st Century Cures Act. And one of the provisions of that, Section 3073, said that the FDA should start some inter-center institutes. Now, we all knew what that first inter-center institute was going to be. That's because there was a patient-centered initiative. It was the Friends of Cancer Research, Jeff Allen and Ellen Siegel, who promoted the concept of having an inter-center institute or center of excellence. So we all knew what the first one was going to be, and that was going to be the Oncology Center of Excellence. And Dr. Rick Pazder, we heard from his deputy, Amy McKee, earlier, that Rick Pazder, Amy McKee, and the people in the Oncology Center for Excellence have provided stellar leadership with the inaugural Center of Excellence. So what is a Center of Excellence? Well, or what does it do more? It leverages the skills of regulatory scientists and reviewers with expertise in a major disease area. And I would say that rare diseases is itself a major disease area. And it harnesses that expertise across the different centers. I was just talking during the break, in fact, with the presenter, Anna, who was from FiberCell, talking about EB. And we were talking to Dr. Celia Witten, who's going to join us in a moment up here, who's the Deputy Director of the Center for Biologics. And again, when we had that April 6th externally led patient-focused drug development meeting on EB, that led within 2 months to the FDA coming out with a draft guidance on EB. What a spectacular achievement of the FDA. I mean, we have to recognize and give plaudits, appropriate plaudits to the FDA when they respond to patient needs that way. And I apologize to Celia because when I was setting that up for April 6th, I was focused exclusively on drugs. And I went to the head of the Office of Drug Evaluation 3, Julia Bites, and to the director and the deputy director of the Division of Dermatology, Kendall Marcus and Jill Lindstrom. I worked with them on setting up what became that April 6th meeting. And I didn't think about biologics. If we have a Center for Excellence, that wouldn't happen. Because we'd have a group who was going to be coordinating across the centers. We wouldn't leave them out. What else does it do? It expedites the development of therapies through an integrated approach in the clinical evaluations of drugs, biologics, devices. We heard a lot today about genomics. We hear a lot about companion diagnostics coming out of the Center for Devices. This means we need this kind of integrated approach. And so it works across CDER, CBER, and the Center for Devices, as well as other groups like the Office of Orphan Products Development. You heard from Deb Lewis, the Deputy Director, earlier today. So why have then a rare disease center of excellence? Well, you know, today we've heard about these exciting new therapies that are changing the way we prevent, diagnose, and treat rare diseases. We heard from Wilson Bryan, the head of the OTAT in the Center for Biologics earlier. He showed us slides on the first 3 gene therapies to get approved, the 2 CAR-T therapies and Luxturna for the ophthalmic disease. And we see that these turn into near cures. You know, I had the privilege of speaking at a 3-day conference at the Vatican in April on regenerative medicine. And I watched, in the first row was Francis Collins, and I watched as people showed slides, videos of children who were treated with genetic diseases and were given gene therapies, and you could see the transformation in their lives. You know, so we stand on the precipice of a time at which we have tremendous scientific advances. How do we harness them? Well, traditional regulatory approaches have become more complicated because we have to rely upon these combination of therapies. We have to look at genomics, diagnostic tests, precision medicine. How do we fit in new concepts like real-world evidence, you know, into the system? These are difficult issues. Why have them struggle at a certain level within each center and then have that be replicated, I guess, you know, kind of building it all over again when you go to a different division or a different center, if you had it all harnessed within one center, within an overarching center for excellence. So numerous parts of the regulatory system need to work together. There are lots of challenges, as we've heard today, in rare disease medical product development, and navigating these issues requires its own set of expertise. And the expertise for rare diseases is inconsistently distributed across review divisions. There are some review divisions that just happen to have more experience with it, and you can see that Dragos Roman and the GI division, you know, the inborn errors of metabolism, Billy Dunn and the neurology division, they have a lot of experience with it. But when I first went to Kendall Marcus and to Jill Lindstrom in dermatology, who are used to dealing with psoriasis and acne, they said, what? You know, so that having a center for excellence could help more evenly distribute by having an overarching focus on rare diseases, having a place, a home for that. So what we are talking about, the EveryLife Foundation, what we put out, is just to jumpstart a conversation. We want to start us all brainstorming, all of us who are dedicated to the notion of helping our sisters and brothers with rare diseases, to start a conversation. And we have 3 elements, 3 components to the proposal. One is the Center for Excellence. Another is to have a standing advisory committee for rare diseases. And the third is, what about having within each office or division a person who's dedicated to rare diseases, a person who is going to be, let's say, the deputy director for rare diseases for a certain office. So I'm going to talk in the next few slides about each one of those proposals. So and I apologize that somehow the headings on these, like the rare disease COE, is kind of whited out. I don't know if the technical genius over here on our side can change that. I doubt it. But I apologize. I think all the slides, Julia, will be made available of all the speakers who give us permission. So all of them will be put up on the website, so you can see them more clearly after today. So, but if you look at these, an inter-center agreement, the first thing I have up there, I learned from Dr. McKee earlier today, is kind of a misunderstanding on my part. I thought that the Center for Excellence, the oncology, had elevated all the signatory authority, that is a sign-off authority for a BLA or an NDA, up to the Center for Excellence. That's not true. You know, she explained to her in her slides that that's not how it operates. What I was showing on this slide is the Rare Disease Center of Excellence is agnostic, is about where the signatory authority should lie. It could go to the Center for Excellence. It could stay, you know, the way it is today. So you need not change, because you establish a rare disease center of excellence, affect where the signatory authority resides. I mean, that's a matter, just as a matter of law. And the statute says the authority to act on every BLA and NDA is where? It's with the Secretary of HHS. Now, the Secretary of HHS has delegated it down to the Assistant Secretary for Health, who has delegated it down to the FDA Commissioner. Now, how far below that it needs to go is a question that's up to, the FDA. Then they can decide that. But what are the other important functions that are independent of the review function that could help? Well, you could harmonize regulatory approaches. We've talked a lot in the different case studies that were presented. We heard about some of this discontinuity, and we could harmonize regulatory approaches. We could coordinate across science initiatives and outreach. We could implement meetings, that could be like the example I gave with the externally led patient-focused drug development meetings on EB. We should come up with shorter acronyms for these things, so I don't have to say that long thing. But that's another task for another day. And then the shareholder engagement. I mean, just think about that. How many of us, well, don't ask for a show of hands, I recognize some faces, were at the congressional caucus that was luncheon in the Senate Dirksen building yesterday that was hosted by the EveryLife Foundation. Now, at that caucus, there were some patients who said, we don't know where we're supposed to go. There were heartbreaking stories from patients who spoke from the audience, who told about their personal life journey with their rare disease and said, we don't know where to go with it. Well, if you had a Center for Excellence for Rare Diseases, I think they'd know where they could go, that they'd have a home. And other things I didn't even list here, like training, could be unified across the FDA. It would provide some visibility across the agency. So another one of the concepts that we have in this proposal is the notion of having a deputy director for rare diseases. So where does this come from? Think about this. I have these examples that we have now a deputy director in each division for safety. We also have an associate director for labeling. How did we get to those? Well, anybody remember Vioxx? That hit us all like a sledgehammer in September 2004 when we realized the safety risks to Americans because of Vioxx. The first congressional hearing that I was asked to speak at was held in February 2005. That led to the FDA law in 2007, which mandated that the FDA should create a deputy director for safety. Now, I think that's worked pretty well, having a deputy director for safety in each review division. The FDA, on its own creative genius, has come up with the idea of having an associate director in each division for labeling to try to coordinate and be able to have that function. Well, what we're suggesting is that perhaps in the same way, whether it's done through the administration, like, for instance, maybe Dr. Woodcock would think about putting into her OND reorganization plan, establishing within each one of her new 7 offices a deputy director for rare diseases. And that would follow the pattern like the FDA creating an associate director for labeling, which was its idea. And so the FDA could make this its idea. And rather than having it go through some language in some appropriations committee report. So there are different ways to get things done. And that's all I'm saying. If the idea has merit, there are ways. Don't worry about how it's going to get done. It'll get done. The question is, does it have merit to have a person in that kind of position? I think if we had that kind of position too, I don't know if this has a, look, I have a little, I don't know if you can see it from there. This would allow us, like the EveryLife Foundation, like NORD, Global Genes, other people could help lobby then Congress for additional funds to have more FTEs that focused on the rare disease program across the different centers at the FDA. That would increase review capacity, within the FDA. And also having a deputy director in each office is kind of like a nice plum too, to have an opportunity for people in the FDA to have advancement. So I think that I'm thinking like a former FDAer, that there are lots of benefits to this that are beyond the benefits that are seen for the patient community. So the third element of, or the third component in our proposal is to have a rare disease advisory committee. So often, I mean, this obviously, people understand advisory committees, you understand how they function. I mean, let's think about that example of Anya was talking about FiberCell. Let's say they go to the advisory committee for dermatology. The dermatology advisory committee is made up with experts who mainly see psoriasis and acne. If we had, and you know what they're going to say? They're going to say what many of you who are in industry or patient advocates have heard. When you go to advisory committees, often, you know, the chairman of the advisory committee say, what are we supposed to do with this data? You know, we're used to seeing data that is much more robust. We're used to seeing many more studies in thousands of patients. Now we've got this small aliquot of data that looks on its face to be pretty compelling, but it doesn't compare with the kind of things you, FDA, have given us before. What are we to do with it? Well, if we had a standing rare disease advisory committee who is made up of experts, you know, who know the science of small trials, they could help their colleagues on the advisory panel get through that. Now, it turns out that there's a barrier to this, that there is a block that the FDA is limited on how many standing advisory committees it can have. And I need to investigate this and find out what is the barrier. I think it's an OMB initiative that said the FDA has to, and so part of that initiative, maybe about 10 years ago, drove the FDA to eliminate some of its standing advisory committees. One of them was called the Drug Abuse Advisory Committee. Think about how easy this would be to lobby for this. Well, members of Congress, there's something called the opioid crisis. And I think that one thing we ought to do is eliminate that OMB ceiling on the number of standing committees the FDA can have to bring in outside expertise, and you ought to have 2 new standing advisory committees. One, the drug abuse, you ought to reconstitute the Drug Abuse Advisory Committee, and you ought to have one for patients with rare diseases. So I think that, you know, we have 3 different components to what we were proposing, but I also would be negligent if I didn't recognize that Dr. Woodcock, and I didn't know what she was going to say earlier today when I drafted up the slides, I knew that Dr. Woodcock is in the midst of a major reorganization of the review function at the FDA. So we know that she's proposing that. She's proposing to have 7 offices. She talked about how this is going to increase because she'll have an office with rare diseases. But within each review division, there's still, and within each office, there will be an inconsistent distribution of that rare disease expertise. And I think that if we had the deputy director in each office, and if we had, there might be a greater confidence that there would be a consistent approach. You know, Dr. Woodcock didn't get an opportunity to address all 3 of the components of ours, so I did talk to her briefly as she was leaving about these other 2 components, and she's warmer to these 2 ideas, you know, the Rare Disease Advisory Committee, as well as having an office deputy director for rare diseases. And she's invited, you know, the EveryLife Foundation to come in and talk to her and her deputy about all 3 of these issues. You remember her last words when she was talking about the Center for Excellence was, you know, I think this merits a deeper conversation about the Center for Excellence. So I think that we can look forward to this, but I'm really was prompted to start this because I recognize we're on the threshold of a dream. You look at science. You look, I'm going to quote Wilson. You know, he said, this sounds like science fiction. Cure diseases. You know, I've worked so long and hard with patients with rare diseases, and I've seen changes that are remarkable. And it's only the tip of the iceberg. But what we have to do is see what we can do to expose the rest of the iceberg, how we can get the rest of it out of the water. And so that's what we're here. It's a different analogy than baseball. I kind of like baseball better. But let's see what we can do to advance the field. And so what we're doing is starting a conversation today. It's not necessarily these 3 points, but it's what else can we do? These are the three that we talked about: the Rare Disease Center for Excellence, the Standing Rare Disease Advisory Committee, an office, leadership that's dedicated to rare disease. But look, there are other initiatives that could increase the visibility for rare disease therapies. We can increase congressional appropriations for FDA rare disease activities. We can enhance the prominence of the FDA activities on surrogates and on accelerated approval. Again, I'm going to compliment the FDA that you notice on surrogates, the FDA under PDUFA 6, I don't know if you notice this, but one of the key objectives that the FDA issued in its 45-page document to implement PDUFA 6 was to say that we're going to recognize a new type of meeting. We're going to recognize that you can have a meeting on surrogates. We want you to come in, you industry, you patients, come in and talk to you academics, come in and talk to us about this. And on accelerated approval, the FDA has also been showing greater interest. So I think that what we're trying to do today is simply jumpstart a conversation. We have a specific proposal because we need something to talk about to start the conversation. But what I'm really doing is reaching out and inviting all of us to together see what we can do to advance the field. So we're starting that conversation. So let's move forward together. Onward.